Now for the biliary system and the pancreatic ducts. To look at those for a little bit. These, we're going to look at how they develop shortly, but just to see how the anatomy of these structures are in the final position. Up here we have the liver. The liver produces bile, and it secretes bile into tiny ducts that gather together and eventually form larger ducts that leave the liver, and these are just called hepatic ducts. Whoops. Hepatic ducts. So lots of very tiny ducts eventually bring that bile together into these larger hepatic ducts. They drain out of the liver. Sometimes this last portion of the hepatic duct is called the common hepatic duct. That then leads into a larger duct down here called the common bile duct. There are sphincters in the common bile duct that cause the bile, as it comes down here, to back up into the gallbladder. And this here is the gallbladder. And there's a duct right here that I didn't leave room to label it hardly. Let's see, right in there, it's called the cystic duct, C-Y-S-T-I-C. That connects the gallbladder to the common bile duct. So that bile, as it backs up in the common bile duct, is pushed back up through the cystic duct into the gallbladder so that it's stored between meals. After a meal, as food is moved into the small intestine, these sphincter muscles are given hormonal and neural cues to relax, and the gallbladder constricts to push the bile out of the gallbladder through the cystic duct and into the common bile duct and on down here. The common bile duct joins with the main pancreatic duct. Here's the main pancreatic duct. And that leads into a small space here where the two come together before entering into the intestine. This is called the ampulla of Vater. So that's where the bile and pancreatic secretions come together into a little like swollen part of the duct before it enters into the intestine. The ampulla of Vater is also known as the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Where it opens into the small intestine right here is known as the hepatoduodenal papilla, because it makes a kind of little bump, a papilla. There's a small bump there on the wall of the intestine. Now you can see I have a small duct that joins from the main pancreatic duct to the intestine, that brown line going across right there. That is an accessory pancreatic duct. Now not everybody has an accessory pancreatic duct, and sometimes when it's still present as a structure in there, it is not functional. But anyway, again, I don't have room to label that very well. The accessory pancreatic duct going through there. The pancreas has two lobes to it, one large lobe that has the main pancreatic duct, and then it has a smaller duct down below a secondary pancreatic duct coming from that smaller lobe on the posterior side of the structure. So these are the primary organs involved here. I didn't label the duodenum. We would have the stomach. This bile duct goes behind the stomach and intestine. It'd be back behind all of that. But anyway, this is the duodenum here. Small intestine. Bile is a chemical that helps to emulsify fat in the intestine. It's also just an excretory byproduct, but it has the advantage of being an emulsifier. This breaks down fatty material in your intestine so that it's smaller bits, so that the digestive enzymes are better able to work on the lipids that are in your diet. So it breaks it down into smaller and smaller masses of lipid in your intestine, that emulsification process. The pancreas produces both enzymes and bicarbonate. Enzymes for digesting all of your different food organic molecule types. The proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. All of those compounds can be broken down by different enzymes that are released from the pancreas. We also release the bicarbonate to neutralize stomach acid from the pancreas. So all of those secretions mix with the bile as it enters into the small intestine here. I want to point out a few important components of the oropharyngeal development. As the head fold comes over, and the head process brings with it the pharynx. This space here would be the pharynx. And this would be the outside of the body. This region right here will eventually form your oral and nasal cavity and your pituitary gland. So I'm just going to put an arrow right here. This area is referred to as a stomodium. Stomodium. So we're going to be looking at events happening right here at the stomodium. Where the endoderm of the gut lies close to that ectoderm of the stomodium, where the blue and the yellow, the orange, come together right there, that's going to set up for us something we know as the oral membrane. The oral membrane is sometimes called the oropharyngeal membrane, but anyway, that's a contact zone between endoderm and ectoderm. So at this stage, the oral nasal cavity does not connect to the gut in the embryo. So next we'll look at the changes that occur right here. In our next picture, we see that this little pouch develops off of that region we had identified as stomodium. This little pouch right here is called the Rathke's pocket. Rathke's pocket. Your anterior pituitary is derived from Rathke's pocket. This is still your oronasal space. And this is still pharynx. Our oral membrane is now broken open, so we have connection between the oral cavity and the pharynx. That membrane breaks down. Now we're going to show the next stage in the formation of the pituitary here. In this next picture, we can see that our Rathke's pocket has moved further away from our oropharyngeal region and is just barely connected to it. It will eventually completely separate from that. We'll have the floor of our skull develop in there between the oronasal cavity and the anterior pituitary. So that Rathke's pocket becomes the anterior pituitary. A part of the floor of your brain, known as the hypothalamus of your brain, produces this little extension that becomes the posterior pituitary. So anyway, this is hypothalamus. that region of the brain right there where we have the posterior pituitary developing. Posterior pituitary is also known as a neurohypophysis. Anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis. Adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis make up a single unit in the end we just refer to typically as the pituitary, and we already know that it rests in that sella turcica of the skull, in the sphenoid. So eventually these two parts, the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary, snug up to one another, become very closely associated. The posterior pituitary kind of hangs down from a connection to the hypothalamic region of the brain to form that little tiny finger-like extension from the brain, the posterior pituitary. And this little bulb of the anterior pituitary kind of wraps around that stalk that comes down to form the posterior pituitary gland. Our next topic is the development of the pharynx, some special features of the pharynx. As the pharynx develops, we develop these pharyngeal arches or visceral arches that we've made reference to before. They would form gill openings back here in a fish, but in higher organisms, we just are left with these what we call pharyngeal arches. And there's a pharyngeal arch number 1, we'll label with the Roman numeral 1. Then there's pharyngeal arch number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. So we have the different visceral arches developing in here. Remember that the first arch is the mandibular arch, and it has both the lower jaw and the upper jaw. In this picture right here, the way I have it drawn, that oropharyngeal membrane and eventual opening between the oral cavity and the pharynx would be like here. That would be the opening into the pharynx from the front. So this is, like I said, pharyngeal arch 1. Behind pharyngeal arch 1, there's both a depression in front, on the outside and on the inside of the pharynx. This is known, this first indentation here is known as a pharyngeal cleft. So this is pharyngeal cleft 1. On the inside, don't have a good place to draw this very well. We call these pharyngeal pouches. So we have pharyngeal cleft 1, pharyngeal cleft 2, pharyngeal cleft 3, pharyngeal cleft 4. On the inside we'd have pharyngeal pouch 1, pharyngeal pouch 2, pharyngeal pouch 3, pharyngeal pouch 4. So we just have them in a sequence. There's a little bit of a fifth element in there as well, but fifth pouch. So anyway, that's how things are structured. This is a section looking down on the floor of the pharynx. Also in the pharynx here, there's a depression about right here from which we will develop the thyroid gland. It's known as the foramen cecum. There, and back in this area of the pharynx, right in here, we're going to begin the formation of our lower respiratory passages. This is the laryngotracheal groove. Laryngotracheal groove. In our next picture, we're going to show where the tonsils, parathyroid, thyroid, thymus, and ultimobranchial bodies come from. They are associated with these pharyngeal pouches, as well as showing where our eustachian tube and eardrum have their origins. So that's in the next picture. So here we are in the next stage. Recall that this was pharyngeal pouch number 1. This was pharyngeal cleft number 1. This becomes your eustachian tube right here between arch 1 and arch 2, right here. So this would be your external acoustic meatus. I'm going to just put auditory canal. How's that? Auditory canal. Your external auditory canal. There from the first cleft on the outside. Then, right here between the two would be where your tympanic membrane would form. Also known as eardrum. Your eardrum's right there. So that's from pouch and cleft number 1. The remainder of the structures we will deal with are all on the inside that develop from these pouches. From pouch number 2, right in here is where we see the beginning of our palatine tonsil. The next structure we want to concern ourselves with is the parathyroid gland. And tissues that form the parathyroid gland have origins both in the third pouch and in the fourth pouch. So both of those will form parathyroid, but also from the third and fourth pouch we get parts of the thymus to develop. So they are from the back part of each of those pouches right there. So here in green, we have parathyroid, and in blue we have thymus. Our next structure will be right here from the wall of the fifth pouch, right in here, something we call an ultimobranchial body. Ultimobranchial body. The ultimobranchial body produces cells that will migrate into the thyroid and produce calcitonin, an important hormone for us. We need to also indicate the position of the thyroid. Thyroid tissues come from that foramen cecum. So here, this is the origin of your thyroid gland. And we still have a laryngotracheal groove back here in the back. That will lead into our larynx, trachea, lungs here. So we know where our palatine tonsils are. They lie just behind our palatoglossal arches and our pharynx there. The parathyroid moves to a position behind the thyroid. The thyroid ends up below your larynx, and there just in front of your larynx, and below it a little bit, runs up and down, makes a kind of an H shape in the final analysis. So this undergoes a extensive migration from a little depression in the floor of the pharynx. It separates from the pharynx and moves to its final location. These two parathyroid structures on each side migrate down also and end up plastered on the back side of your thyroid gland. So there are four little bits of tissue, parathyroid tissue, on the back side of your thyroid gland in its final position. The thymus migrates also, moves down to a lower position. It's behind the sternum. So all of these tissues migrate away from the wall of the pharynx. They start out as epithelial tissues and then migrate away from that epithelium into the deeper tissues and find their way to their final locations. The ultimobranchial body, as I mentioned earlier, those tissues end up embedded in the thyroid gland, mixed in there in the thyroid gland in humans, and become calcitonin producing cells. Parathyroid tissues produce parathyroid hormone. Ultimobranchial tissues produce calcitonin. Next, we're going to revisit the biliary system, pancreas, and liver, and see where these structures come from developmentally. Very interesting origin for the whole thing. Okay, in this view of the embryo, I've tried to draw in the gut to show how the gut looks as the embryo is developing. I probably should have put the pharynx and oral cavity together there to show it a little further along in development. Somewhere up here we would have that thyroid grow off of the pharynx that we talked about a minute ago, and all the other structures that migrate down with it. This would be where the laryngeotracheal groove would be. These would be lungs here. This would be esophagus. Here's stomach. Here's the beginning of the intestine. And it's right here near the beginning of the intestine that we want to look at the formation of structures that become liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. They begin as a dorsal outgrowth and a ventral outgrowth, two different outgrowths simply from the wall of the endoderm of the embryo extending outward. This dorsal one right here, to the dorsal side, will become what we know as dorsal pancreas. On the ventral side over here, we have one little lump growing there that's called the liver diverticulum or hepatic diverticulum. And then the other one right here is going to be the ventral pancreas. Below that on the intestine, we just have more intestine. This is the old connection to the yolk sac. More intestine. Somewhere in here it becomes large intestine after that. This is a lantolus still present. This is the remainder of the posterior intestine and the cloaca region back here in the back. But anyway, these are the parts we're concerned with right now. What's happening with these outgrowths off the wall of the intestine just below the stomach? Dorsal pancreas, hepatic diverticulum, and ventral pancreas. Okay, I have a series of 3 drawings here to show the transition from the initial condition to the final position of some of these structures, or nearly the final position of some of these structures having to do with the biliary system and pancreas. Remember, this is stomach. I'll just put letters in here to represent the different organs. From this area right here, we'll have the liver. This will be gallbladder right here. And this is ventral pancreas, VP. This is dorsal pancreas, DP, over here. So they're still in their original positions. These are on the ventral side. This is on the dorsal side. These are enlarging and they're moving upward. The ventral pancreas kind of remains where it is, and it's connected here initially on the ventral side of the pancreas. The next thing that happens is that this connection on the ventral side moves around to the dorsal side, moves around to the back side. And the ventral pancreas is this structure right here. It's moving around behind. This structure here, this connection to the gallbladder, there's our gallbladder, there's our liver. This is going to be the common bile duct, CBD, there we go. Common bile duct, and this is dorsal pancreas still, right here. So we see these things moving up, liver and gallbladder connected to the common bile duct. Ventral pancreas is moved around to the backside. Eventually this connection of the gallbladder and ventral pancreas and common bile duct and ventral pancreas on the backside will move around all the way to the other side. And that's what we see here in this next drawing. So here we have the liver, we have the gallbladder right here, we have the stomach right here, dorsal pancreas, ventral pancreas. So our common bile duct comes all the way around along with our ventral pancreas right here below the dorsal pancreas. We have two openings here. Eventually, the dorsal pancreas duct will shift over to the ventral pancreas duct so that we join all that together and form that ampulla of Vater location there. That dorsal pancreas connection to the intestine will become the accessory pancreatic duct, which may completely disappear or may be left as just a remnant. So it's not. A very small population of individuals would have that dorsal pancreas duct, that accessory pancreatic duct, remain functional into full development. So anyway, that's the way we get that position of our pancreas eventually having this ventral lobe and this dorsal lobe, all of them draining together into this same duct as what comes down from the common bile duct, forming that ampulla of Vater and that hepatoduodenal papilla on the inside of the intestine. So this is the duodenum right here, the D. So that's how our liver, gallbladder, and pancreas take up their positions and how the ducts assume their positions in connection with the duodenum there. Here we have a view from the website. Just wanted to show something quickly regarding the development of the intestines. So here's the illustration series right along here. First of all, here's the stomach. Below that we have the small intestine. We still see the connection to the yolk sac right here, this extension out this way. And then the remainder of the intestine down to the cloaca, and off the cloaca here we have the allantois, that extension right there. So in the next picture, we see a reduction of that connection to the yolk sac, so it's just this little tab right here, and I indicate the enlargement of the beginning of the cecum. So this is where the small intestine ends and the large intestine begins. So here's large intestine here. The allantois is starting to separate from the lower portion of the colon, the intestine, right through here, and eventually will completely separate from the allantois right there. The large intestine is going to be pushed up and around while the small intestine lengthens and forms all these coils. So in the next picture, here's stomach. There's the small intestine starting to form all these loops. The large intestine is still enlarging and is going to loop all the way around. And we still have connection to the allantois, which is forming the urinary bladder right here in this case. So we're going to separate the digestive system from the urinary system right here. So we'll have separate openings for the digestive system and urinary system to the outside, and that common cloacal space will disappear. The stomach here, small intestine, now forming more and more lengthening loops, and now we have the entrance of the small intestine into the cecum, formation of the appendix, and then we have all the structure of the large intestine showing here. So that shows the gradual progressive steps to get our intestine to its final position. We lose the connection to the yolk sac. We form a new valve here between small and large intestine posterior to that connection to the yolk. We separate the allantois from the gut in the final stage there, and we grow the appendix off of the cecum. Here's a little more on that separation of the allantois from the colon here. This common space where the urinary system, reproductive system, and digestive system all come together before exiting the body there. That's called the cloaca. So here's our colon, here's our cloaca, there's the allantois. and between it was what we call the urorectal fold. So this urorectal fold will eventually completely separate the urinary reproductive system from the digestive system. And that's what we see here in the next picture. We have more separation there. So this is the old allantois. Here it's going to form the bladder and urethra from this over here, and this is the colon over here. So finally, the last part of it here, now we're going to call this last part of the colon the rectum. We've got the bladder, urinary bladder here, the urethra, and then this area here is referred to as urogenital sinus at this stage of development. So it will remain kind of a urogenital sinus combination in males, but separate eventually in females to form a separate urethral opening and vagina.